what is the next direction in jazz, but I don't know. They look to someone else.
To whom?
I don't know.
Amidst vicious attacks, sabotage, brutal physical confrontations, life-threatening assaults, and lawsuits orchestrated by trusted colleagues, Miles Davis carved out a career like no other. At a time when music was still finding its modern form, he broke records, rewrote the rules, and gave the world timeless gems like Blue and Green. He was not just a genius, he was a man unfiltered, sharp-tongued, and brutally honest about who he didn't respect. He could praise you one moment and tear you to shreds the next. And when Miles Davis said he hated you, the whole world heard it. Here are the 7 artists Miles Davis openly clashed with, criticized, and downright hated the most, and the intense stories behind it. The unhealthy competition with the number 2 person on this list is no joke. But let's start off with one of the greatest saboteurs of them all. Number 7 on the list, Herbie Hancock.
One of the big problems that Miles had with me,
at a time when joining Davis' band was literally a dream come true for many young talents out there, Hancock was one of the very lucky few who got that chance. Davis had once shared that Hancock wasn't exactly the kind of talent he was looking for, but there was a strange bond between them, something unspoken that made Davis take him in. What he didn't know at the time was that this very bond would cost him more than he could ever imagine, turning respect into rivalry and trust into tension. In the spring of 1963, at just 23, Hancock joined Davis's band. He was young, raw, eager, and far from the polished sound Miles demanded. Davis, the giant of modern jazz, took him under his wing not because Hancock was perfect, but because he sensed potential. For a while, things ran smoothly. Hancock followed Davis's lead, learning the rules of the stage. But ambition has a way of eroding humility. Hancock soon began to offer unsolicited input, pulling the rhythm section in directions Miles hadn't asked for. To Davis, this wasn't creativity or help, it was sabotage. In one interview, David said, "Man, he doesn't even know the sound I want, and he's telling everyone in my band how to play." Davis didn't stop at just that. He sparked conversations within the band and industry when he threw a shade at Hancock by claiming he was not even original and creative enough to lead a band like his.
we grow. And the only way we can grow is to have a mind that's open enough.
In 1965, Hancock confirmed what Davis had said. At a heavily anticipated show in New York, the hall was packed, critics ready, the press leaning in. This was Davis's moment to unveil a bold new sound. The band launched into one of his signature numbers, the horns blazing, the rhythm tight. Then it happened. Hancock struck a wrong chord. Not a small mistake, but a glaring, discordant stab that froze the entire room.
Right in the middle of his solo, I played the wrong chord.
The horns wavered, the rhythm stumbled, and for a split second, the brilliance of Miles Davis seemed on the verge of collapse. Though the band recovered, the damage was done. A huge one at that. The audience clapped cautiously, critics scribbled furiously, and Miles's reputation as the flawless band leader took a visible dent. Backstage, Davis confronted him, his voice low and furious. "You ever try that again and you'll never see this stage with me again." Hancock, defiant yet shaken, answered with words that would hang between them for years. "Maybe the stage deserves more than just your way, Miles Davis." From that night, the air between them was poisoned. Davis began to see every late arrival, every unannounced chord change as proof of betrayal. Hancock, on the other hand, saw himself as fighting for freedom within the music. "I wasn't trying to tear him down," he later said. "I just wanted the music to breathe." By 1968, the bond was beyond repair. Davis turned to electric sounds, leaving Hancock feeling sidelined. The younger pianist soon found his own audience in the world of fusion, critics praising him for the very boldness Miles had condemned. "He thinks he found his own voice," Miles muttered in a 1969 interview. "But it started right here with me." In the end, what began as an unspoken bond became a silent war, yet really loud for Davis. That single wrong chord, played on one of the most important nights of Davis's career, became a symbol of the fracture between mentor and protege. For Miles Davis, it was the moment he realized that sometimes the greatest wounds don't come from rivals. They come from those you once trusted the most. But with number 6, it gets even more interesting. John Coltrane. Davis was known to always refer to Coltrane as talented yet self-afflicted. Davis and Coltrane were soul brothers, shared common dreams, goals, values, and even lifestyles. Davis often recalled how they both synced on the first day of meeting each other. Sadly, their similar lifestyles ended up becoming the very deal breaker in their relationship. As someone Davis was really fond of, Coltrane entered his world at a time when the trumpeter was reshaping the sound of jazz. It was 1955 when Coltrane joined the Miles Davis Quintet. For Davis, Coltrane's voice on the tenor saxophone was like thunder laced with silk, raw yet refined, capable of carrying the deepest emotion. Together they were unstoppable, building music that felt like prophecy. But underneath that brilliance lurked a shadow Davis couldn't ignore. Coltrane's growing dependence on heroin became the crack in their brotherhood. Davis himself had wrestled with addiction in the early 50s, a nightmare he barely survived. He knew the endless cycle, the missed rehearsals, the blurred focus, the desperate search for the next fix. Watching Coltrane slip into the same pit was like looking into a mirror he wanted to smash. At first, Miles tried patience. He ignored the missed cues in rehearsals, the hours Coltrane disappeared before gigs, and even the long silences that addiction carved into their friendship. But the patience wore thin. One night, after another rehearsal ended in frustration, Miles confronted him directly. "You're wasting the gift you got, Train. You can't drag the whole band down with you." Coltrane snapped back. "Maybe you just don't understand how I find my sound." It was the kind of answer that infuriated Miles, an excuse wrapped in arrogance, fueled by a needle. The conflict escalated. Musicians whispered about arguments that shook the walls. Davis's temper was sharp, but Coltrane, under the influence, became unpredictable.
And my band reacted to it, you know.
In one heated moment, high and out of control, Coltrane shoved Davis against a wall, shouting incoherently about being unappreciated. For Miles, that was unforgivable. He had taken Coltrane in as a brother, defended him when others doubted his discipline, and this was the repayment: violence born out of self-destruction. Days later, Davis quietly removed him from the quintet. To the public, it looked like a simple lineup change. Behind closed doors, it felt like betrayal. Years later, Coltrane fought his way out of addiction and rebuilt himself into a drug-free figure. But in cleaning his image, he began telling stories that cast Davis in a darker light. Coltrane suggested that Davis had stifled him, that leaving the band was liberation rather than consequence. To Miles, these narratives were salt in an open wound. What cut deepest was not the music lost, but the distortion of truth. Davis hated the addiction that had consumed Coltrane, but he hated even more the way his old friend rewrote history after defeating it. To him, it wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. Their bond had begun as a meeting of equals, two restless souls determined to change the face of jazz. It ended with Davis scarred, convinced that the man he once called a brother had turned his back on him in every way that mattered. Number 5, Quincy Jones.
Miles was terrifying when you first met him, you know.
When he first met Lionel Hampton?
Oh, Miles? Please.
Jones worked with the biggest artists in the 90s. He was part of the music world, and the music world was part of him. To many, Jones was more than just a producer. He was a kingmaker, a figure who could turn raw talent into legends. His fingerprints were on some of the most successful projects of the decade, such as Michael Jackson's timeless records. If music was a kingdom, Jones ruled it with quiet authority and an ear sharper than steel. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew he was shaping history, and that confidence often bordered on arrogance. To his peers, Jones wasn't just producing records, he was rewriting the rules, sometimes stepping on toes, sometimes crushing egos. Even Davis himself had complicated feelings about Quincy despite their cordial relationship. Their paths crossed in different eras, and while Davis respected Quincy's musical genius, he never forgave him for what he saw as opportunism.
Just like I would do if I was kissing you.
Davis, ever the purist, believed music was supposed to be raw, dangerous, and stripped to the bone. Quincy, in his eyes, polished it too much, made it glamorous for the sake of mainstream appeal. He turns the fire into glitter. Davis was once quoted as saying in private circles, by the time the 90s came around, Jones had become more than a musician. He was an institution. He worked with the giants of pop, hip-hop, and R&B, his influence radiating across Billboard charts and Hollywood studios. And yet, his dominance attracted as much criticism as it did praise. Younger artists accused him of controlling too much, of deciding what was real music and what wasn't. Some whispered that working with Jones was a double-edged sword. He could make your career soar, but he could also own your legacy. Davis, who had always mistrusted producers who basked in the spotlight, saw Jones as someone who fed off other people's shine. The two men respected each other on the surface, but beneath it lay a quiet hostility. Jones, on the other hand, seemed unfazed by the criticism. He brushed it off with charm, always ready with a smile and a story, always surrounded by the biggest stars of the time. To him, greatness was not about pleasing purists. It was about creating soundtracks that would outlive them all. Just before his death, Jones shared in a magazine interview that Davis made his all-time favorite music. Till date, many remain shocked about the dynamics between Davis and Jones' relationship. However, one thing is sure, to Davis, Jones was the man who sold the soul of music. Number 4, Ron Carter.
The first time I met him was the spring of 1957.
When Carter joined Davis's second-grade quintet in the 1960s, the chemistry was electric. Carter's precision and control balanced Davis's fire. And for a time, it seemed like they were destined to stand shoulder to shoulder as pioneers of modern jazz. But in the shadows of that harmony, resentment began to brew. Resentment that Carter later unleashed in vicious attacks against the very man who had given him the stage. In the beginning, Davis admired Carter's discipline. He was dependable, always on time, always locked in. But the very quality that Davis saw as strength became a point of friction. Davis lived for risk, chaos, and raw edges. Carter played like an architect, careful and deliberate. Their rehearsals often turned into silent wars. Davis pushing for recklessness, Carter pulling for order. At first, it was just creative tension. But soon, Carter began to see Davis not as a mentor, but as a tyrant who he increasingly couldn't stand. The attack started quietly, whispers to journalists, subtle jabs in interviews. Carter suggested that Davis was overrated, that his brilliance was exaggerated by the myth around his name. For Davis, who valued loyalty above all else, this was betrayal. Man builds his house and then you try to burn it down? He muttered to a confidant after reading one of Carter's digs in the press. But Carter didn't stop. By the late 1970s, his comments grew harsher. He accused Davis of abandoning jazz's roots, of chasing fusion and electric sounds for money rather than art. To fans, it sounded like professional critique. To Miles, it was a knife aimed at his legacy. Carter once remarked in a public forum, "Miles stopped playing for the music. He started playing for the image." The sting was deep. Davis had bled for his craft. And here was a man he once trusted, dismissing it as vanity. A while later, Davis retaliated by likening Carter to a mere conductor in the most demeaning way.
You never see a conductor, man, turn and facing the audience.
However, Carter persisted in his attacks. The most vicious blow came in the 1980s when Davis returned from retirement. While the jazz world celebrated the comeback, Carter openly criticized the new band's sound, calling it unfocused and hollow. He went further, telling a European magazine that Davis was a shadow of what he once was. For a man like Miles, who thrived on reinvention, those words were unforgivable. The bond they had shared on stage, the nights spent breaking ground in smoky clubs, the trust that made their quintet legendary, all of it seemed erased by Carter's relentless attack. Years later, Carter shared that he was merely criticizing Davis and nothing more.
Because I was kind of put in this role, I had a different point of view. The band had a different point of view.
And yet, Davis never fully struck back. He carried the anger in silence, channeling it into his trumpet instead. But those close to him knew the wound was there. Number 3, Jimmy Heath.
Working with young musicians is always a challenge. Because they're going to always, it's like teaching.
Heath crossed paths with David in the bustling jazz circles of the late 1950s. They were not bandmates, but colleagues who often found themselves sharing stages, jam sessions, and long nights in smoky clubs where ideas flowed as freely as the liquor. Heath, with his sharp compositions and quicksilver saxophone lines, was gaining respect as both a writer and a player. Davis, meanwhile, was already an outstanding figure, shaping jazz into something no one had heard before. For a time, their paths ran parallel. There was mutual recognition, until one composition shattered the cordial relationship between them. On April 2, 1958, after a show in New York, whispers began to spread. Heath had recognized a tune in Davis's new set that sounded strikingly similar to something he had been working on privately. To Heath, it wasn't just coincidence, it was theft. Within weeks, he made his accusation public, claiming Davis had lifted the essence of his song without giving credit. By May 10, 1958, Heath's lawyers had filed papers, turning what could have been a quiet dispute into front-page gossip across the jazz scene. The lawsuit threatened to drag both men into court, but industry insiders, promoters, producers, and fellow musicians came together to cool the flames. Many years after the incident, Heath recounted how Davis failed to show up on the initial day when industry insiders had arranged a meeting aimed at reconciling their differences.
Miles didn't come. I don't know where Miles was that day, but
A public court battle between two of jazz's brightest names could have damaged not just their reputations, but the community as a whole. Meetings were held in back offices, phone calls stretched into the early morning hours, and slowly the matter was steered away from the courtroom. The lawsuit never flew. It dissolved into a murky handshake deal behind closed doors. But the bitterness did not disappear. Davis, proud and unforgiving, carried the wound like a scar. Radio interviews captured the tension at its peak. Heath, speaking on a Philadelphia station in 1958, did not hold back. Just because he is a bigger name does not mean I won't speak up. Miles took what wasn't his, and if I don't speak up, people think I never wrote a note. That's not how I want my name remembered. Davis, a week later on a New York broadcast, fired back with his own icy dismissal. Jimmy talks like I need his little tunes to make my music. I don't steal, I create. If he can't handle being in the same space as me, that's his problem, not mine. The industry may have silenced the legal fight, but the personal one raged on. Heath continued to build his career, carrying himself with quiet pride, while Davis never forgot what he saw as a stab in the back. Number 2, Steve Miller.
I was just doing whatever I wanted to do, and I turned it into the record company, and one of the
Back in the 1960s and 70s, there was a cold war between white and black artists. At that time, Davis was the star artist for the blacks, while Miller was the star artist for the whites in the music industry. Davis had clawed their way through discrimination, segregation, and an industry that thrived on exploiting their genius without giving due respect. Meanwhile, white artists like Steve Miller walked into arenas already handed a spotlight, their sound polished for radio, their names amplified by a system eager to crown them stars. For Davis, the contrast was impossible to ignore.
You know, those Uncle Tom words that white people use.
The clash came to a head in 1970 when Davis and his band were booked at the Fillmore East in New York. Columbia Records thought pairing jazz with rock would broaden audiences, but Miles saw it as an insult. He was a legend, a pioneer, and yet he was being placed before what he considered a lightweight act. Backstage, he seethed, muttering to anyone who would listen, "Man, I gotta open for this sorry-ass cat." The tension spilled onto the stage. Miles deliberately delayed his set, forcing Miller to perform first, then stormed out with his band and unleashed a blistering show that drowned out the memory of the headliner. Critics in the audience later remarked that Miller's performance felt flat and forgettable after Davis's firestorm. For Miles, this wasn't just music. It was war. Miller, stung by the disdain, fired back in interviews. On a San Francisco broadcast, he accused Davis of arrogance. Miles acts like he invented sound itself. Rock isn't beneath him. He's just too bitter to see it. Davis's response cut sharper. "Steve Miller? That's white noise, man. He don't have shit going for him." What could have been a crossover celebration became a cold reminder of racial and artistic divides. For Davis, Miller wasn't just another musician. He was the face of an industry that undervalued black brilliance while overhyping white mediocrity. Number 1, Wynton Marsalis.
And I was always paranoid about not ever being able to play good enough. Never being able to play good enough.
Marsalis was one artist that Davis openly and constantly dismissed his talent. Their feud was quite popular. To Davis, Wynton Marsalis was like the museum side of jazz, stuck in the past, clinging to tradition, and too afraid to take risks. Davis, always chasing the future, viewed Marsalis's brand of conservatism as suffocating. He once remarked in disgust, "Man, that kid plays like he's scared of tomorrow." The tension boiled over in the 1980s when Marsalis began publicly criticizing Davis's fusion experiments. Marsalis argued that electric jazz betrayed the roots of the art form, stripping it of its purity.
Maybe later he'll develop he'll develop another style.
Davis, however, saw Marsalis as insecure, hiding his low self-esteem behind big words and classical technique. According to those close to him, Davis believed Marsalis wanted validation more than artistry, constantly comparing himself to legends but never daring to step outside his comfort zone. By the mid-1980s, their feud had become impossible to ignore. Marsalis criticized Davis in interviews, accusing him of abandoning the tradition of jazz for fusion and electric experiments. Davis in turn struck back with venom. On a 1985 New York radio interview, he scoffed, "That kid ain't got it. He talks like a professor because he don't have the guts to make anything new." Marsalis, though clearly stung, tried to defend himself in measured tones. Speaking on a radio broadcast weeks later, he said, "I respect Miles, but I don't respect music that's just noise. Jazz has rules, and those rules matter." To Davis, that response only proved what he already thought. that Marsalis's low self-esteem was wrapped up in tradition. He believed Marsalis needed the safety of old forms to hide his fear of innovation. For Davis, jazz was about evolution, risk, and daring the unknown. Marsalis, in his eyes, was too fragile to ever reach that height. For Davis, Marsalis symbolized fear disguised as philosophy, a musician too worried about approval to embrace change. Their conflict wasn't just about notes, it was about vision. Where Davis saw the future, Marsalis saw danger. And in Davis's eyes, that fear was the very reason Marsalis would never stand in his league, and he never wanted to have anything to do with Marsalis, just like the others on this list. Let's know your thoughts in the comments section. Subscribe to this channel for more videos like this, like and share.